They taped red paint buckets to my lumber pile and called it a message. They called the cops on me for using the beach I own. I came here to disappear, not to start a war, and 3 weeks later, I was the man who made the HOA president fall into handcuffs. I drove up the sand track with the windows down, the Ford's tires cracking over oyster shells like someone stepping on glass. The cabin sat half swallowed by vines, sagging a little stubborn, as if it had a personality of its own. I'm Ethan Miller. I used to argue maritime law for a living, 2 decades of suits and briefs and jurisdictional footwork, until one day I sold the condo, packed a duffel, and bought an old deed dated 1943 for $28,000. It wasn't pretty. It smelled like salt and dust and old coffee. It was honest. It was mine. The first knock wasn't on my door. It was the crunch of gravel, a deputy's cruiser easing onto the track, and then the click of a heel on sand. Karen Whitmore stepped out of a white Lexus like she'd just walked off the cover of a design magazine. Linen pants, oversized sunglasses, bracelets that jangled when she gestured. She announced, as if that fact carried the law, "I'm the president of Coastal Ridge Shores, HOA." The deputy said politely, "We have a complaint about possible unpermitted construction." Karen folded her arms and said with clinical patience, "You must stop. Our residents are disturbed." I handed the deputy the deed like a talisman. Old ink, a clause about riparian rights. The smell of paper that had seen storms none of us remembered. He skimmed it, nodded, said he'd take it back to the office. Karen's eyes slid past the paper like it was a bad prop in a play. "That agreement is ancient," she said. "This community beach was established in 2012. She used the phrase, peaceful enjoyment, the polite little weapon HOA presidents use to make the law sound like neighborliness. I told the deputy the shoreline beyond the mean high tide line was public, that the federal public trust doctrine still had teeth. He shrugged, said he'd confirm. She walked back to her Lexus and said low enough so only I heard, "You'll regret this." I laughed, the kind of laugh that tries to be brave. Then the stop work notice showed up taped to my backhoe like a white flag nailed to a corpse. No signature, just a county seal, and that neutral bureaucratic language. All construction suspended, pending investigation. My suppliers postponed deliveries. The framing crew texted that their insurance rep advised them to stand down, and a half-dozen men I'd hired 1 week were suddenly not coming back. Coastal towns gossip fast, faster than the tide, and by the weekend someone had posted a cropped photo of my backhoe dumping what looked like waste into the marsh. The image angle was familiar. I'd been the first to notice the shine on the camera lens at the right time. The company Ricky worked for had access. I did what lawyers do when they're anxious. I documented everything. Phone photos, timestamps, a log of every call. I put a motion-activated camera in the trailer and a recorder behind a shelf because paranoia and experience look a lot alike. I found the bitter part of the job creeping back into me. The old habits were useful. Evidence doesn't gossip. Evidence remembers. There was a week when despair felt like a tide coming in slow, inevitable. I sat on the tailgate of the truck the night the crew packed up for the last time and thought about selling the lot, cutting my losses, driving away. I stood in the trailer with the stop work notice in my pocket, counting the money left in my account, measuring the cost in phone calls returned with silence. I thought of the fisherman who'd signed that deed in 1943 and how he would probably have laughed at the idea that people in pastel houses would one day claim the water as theirs. I remember whispering to the dark, maybe I picked the wrong hill to die on. Then Ricky showed up with answers he didn't mean to give me. He was polite, too polite. He left his phone out like a bad actor, and I watched him on camera phone held to his ear, voice low. "500, he said. "I can delay the inspection. Another 2 if I can get into the permit box." The recording was crisp. I watched it 4 times. The rage that came through wasn't loud. It was surgical. I knew in that moment this wasn't an argument about a dock. It was sabotage, and sabotage leaves a trail. I drove 3 hours to Charleston to a law office with my name still faded on the glass. Tom Whitaker answered the door with salt in his hair and curiosity in his eyes. 2 hours later, we had a motion for a preliminary injunction so tight you could have used it to block a storm surge and a plan that didn't play to anyone's theatrics. We weren't aiming for a headline. We were aiming for a freeze. Their power to write citations, freeze their bank accounts, freeze the small legal mechanisms they'd weaponized. The court clerk's stamp sounded like a bell. That should have been enough to make someone stop, but people who build empires on not being checked rarely sit quietly. 2 things happened that week that made me realize how far Karen would go. First, someone slashed the fence and painted red across a stack of treated lumber. The paint looked dramatic in the gray light, like someone trying to stage a crime scene. Second, an anonymous email arrived at 2 a.m. with a PDF attachment, a transcript from a board meeting 6 years prior. Karen's voice, clear as a bell, said, "If we control access, we control the beach. No one's going to check the federal maps." That line landed in my chest like a cold stone. Armed with the recorded bribe, the vandal footage, the deed, and the transcript, we pushed the case up the ladder. A contact at the Coastal Waterways Commission dug into old survey maps and found an index code, FAP-17, a federal access point notation from a 1961 chart that showed my strip of shoreline had been registered as public in wartime logistics. In short, the HOA had been running a private beach on federal property for years. The jerk in me loved the irony. The better man in me remembered all the people who paid dues they shouldn't have and were too scared to ask where their money went. When the federal team arrived, they didn't come with fanfare. Black SUVs eased down the sand agents with cameras and badges that didn't care about HOA titles. They photographed fences, tagged unpermitted structures, cataloged signs that proclaimed private beach as evidence of obstruction. Karen arrived in a hat that could cast shade across an entire meeting and tried to command the scene. The agent looked at her flat and procedural and said, "Ma'am, this site is under federal jurisdiction. We're documenting violations." You could see the moment the robe came off, pride blurting protests, then scrambling. She started barking for counsel. She started pointing fingers at people who used to call her neighbor. They led her away in handcuffs. It's a small, cinematic moment, the kind you think won't ever belong to your life. Her sunglasses hit the sand, and she didn't bend to pick them up. She shouted something toward me, half curse, half plea, and the surf ate it. I didn't cheer. I just felt the air change like a storm, finally letting go of pressure. Boxes of records went into the SUVs. Photographs of fake nonprofit filings, bank statements with misdirected HOA funds, minutes showing a knowing decision to hide maps, all of it came into the light. The trial was a kind of slow thunder. The prosecution laid out the money, the maps, the recordings. One by one, board members who had nodded along in meetings sat under oath and coughed up confessions. We thought no one would check. One treasurer said, voice small. The judge called it a systematic abuse of community trust. I sat in the second row, watching scenes I used to write legal briefs about unfold as human drama. The verdict was heavy and absolute guilty on fraud, obstruction, falsification. Karen and 2 others received prison terms, and the HOA was placed under federal receivership. The courtroom exhaled, not with bowed triumph, but with relief, a hush that felt almost sacred. I walked out that day, and the world looked quieter, like someone had creased a map and a new route had opened. I never wanted the spotlight. I wanted a cabin and the sound of waves. But getting my beach back meant exposing a lie built over years, ripping out rotten bolts and faked ledgers. The final scene I remember is not a party. It's simple. The paint still smeared on the lumber, a caution tape flapping in a gentle wind, agents packing a box of ledgers into a government SUV. I stood by the new post hole where the HOA sign used to be and watched the tide inch up over the old pilings. The beach, the actual beach, not the idea some woman tried to privatize, claimed the sand like it always had. They didn't give me a parade. They gave me papers, a judge's order, the quiet settlement of a thing returning to its place. I did not clap. I walked the pier at dusk, the wood cool beneath my bare feet, and thought of the fisherman who signed that original deed. He didn't fight for headlines. He fought for a place to tie a boat. That's what this always was. Don't mistake this for a victory lap. It's an accountability moment. The law can be a weapon, but it can also be a shield if you remember which end to hold. Justice is quiet and shows up with evidence.